Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining the fourth quarter four webinar. We are going to start momentarily, just going to give it 1 or 2 more minutes to let a few folks join in, and then we will begin with the presentation. Hello, everybody. Welcome to fourth Utility Working Group webinar for quarter four 2019. Today's topic is managed charging. My name is Connor Herman. I'm a program manager at Fourth and will be monitoring the webinar today. Cover a few logistical details. All participants will be muted throughout the webinar. To ask questions, please use the attendee chat feature, which you can access by clicking the button in the top left corner of the screen. I'll be fielding questions as they come in and pass them to speakers at the end of the presentation. Following the webinar, we'll be sending out a recording of the presentation to all attendees along with the presenter slides. To introduce Fourth, we are a nonprofit trade organization based in Portland, Oregon, comprised of nearly 200 member organizations. We advocate for the adoption of electric, shared, and smart mobility options in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. We're involved in 4 main focus areas, including industry development, policy advocacy, demonstration projects, and consumer engagement. I also want to remind everyone that we are co-hosting EVS 33, the world's largest electric mobility conference, in June 2020 right here in Portland, Oregon. If you have any questions about EVS, please contact our international marketing manager, Ashley Duplanty, and you can find her email at the bottom of this slide. Finally, I want to welcome our awesome speakers for today, Erika Myers and Erika Maurer. Erika is a principal of transportation electrification for the Smart Electric Power Alliance, SEPA. Erika has 15 years experience in the clean energy sector and specializes in the nexus between the grid, electric vehicles, and renewable energy. She heads SEPA's Transportation Electrification Research and was awarded the 2019 Public Utility Fortnightly Under 40 Award for her work around vehicle grid integration. She authored and co-authored numerous reports, briefs, and articles, and regularly speaks at events around the country. Eric is a product developer at Xcel Energy. Eric develops new residential pilot projects to test new technologies and leverage existing programs to create value for the grid. He has developed and filed pilots for EV charging, residential battery demand response, and the use of demand response and energy efficiency to defer distribution investment. Prior to working at Xcel, Eric was a manager in Rocky Mountain Institute's electricity practice. At RMI, he led energy strategy consulting projects with cities, states, and companies and co-authored RMI's 2011 book, Reinventing Fire. And now I'm going to let Erika take it away with her presentation.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. For those on the phone who know me, they might know that I am very passionate about managed charging. So I'm very happy to be participating in the webinar today. And as always, I'm happy to take any phone calls or emails afterwards to follow up on any of the remarks I gave as part of this webinar. So my focus is going to be today on two research products that we published this year, one called A Comprehensive Guide to Electric Vehicle Managed Charging, and the other that we just published actually last Wednesday called Residential Electric Vehicle Rates That Work, Attributes That Increase Enrollment. So I'll be talking about two different kinds of what we consider managed charging. But first, I wanted to just briefly touch on who is SEPA. We are a 501c3 organization based in Washington, D.C. We've been around for 25 years, mostly working towards solar goals with utilities, but we just recently expanded back in about 5 years ago, actually, into these new distributed energy resource topics, which include electric vehicles. Just this year, we actually created 4 pathways where most of our research is aligned. Those relate to utility business models, regulatory innovation, grid integration, and transportation electrification. I'd encourage you to take a look at our website, sepapower.org, to take a little bit more look at what we're working on and some of the information that we've published under these pathways this year. Underneath the transportation and electrification pathway, we actually have some priority topic areas. So most of our research is related to utility rates, tariffs, and incentives, managed charging, distribution planning, and EV education. So we think of managed charging as having 2 different forms. First is passive managed charging, which relies on customer behavior to affect charging patterns. This is also known as behavioral load control from a demand response perspective. This could include things like rate design, or even something as simple as sending a text message to an EV driver asking them to delay their charge. It also could include things like incentive programs. We also have defined a second realm called active managed charging. And this is more direct load control that you would be able to aggregate and then adjust basically up, down, on, or off the state of charge through the charging device, the vehicle itself with automaker telematics, or through things like smart circuit breakers or panels. You could also possibly do it through things like AMI collars, metering collars. So there's a lot of different strategies of how you would actually do active load control that are outlined in a report. First, I wanted to talk from a high level about load management options that utilities might be making decisions about. Granted, not every utility is at the same starting place. Obviously, a lot of things depend on the parameters by which they're designing a program. Penetration of residential EVs, or actually any electric vehicles, would probably be the first place you would start to define what kind of strategy you may want to undertake. But you might also have a closer look at what sort of available distribution capacity you have in your systems. Maybe there's some specific substations or transformers that might be constrained that would help define what sort of program you would develop. Also, what are your goals? So if you were, let's say, for example, in a territory that had a lot of renewables, maybe your goal is to increase the amount of use of those assets. It also would depend on your on-peak electricity prices, especially if you work with the GNT. Maybe you are motivated to try to reduce the costs for peak period usage. So all of those parameters, and this is just very much an illustrative example, first for passive might help define which strategy you would pursue first. So a lot of times when we think about rate design, the first thing people think of is the time of use rate. But the research report we just published wants to think more, encourages utilities to think more broadly beyond time of use rates to things that might be more dynamic, which would help encourage different customer behavior on a more regular basis rather than just adjustments by season. The other approach, for example, would be active load management. And again, it's very much the variables that you have in your service territory might dictate which strategies you would pursue. So if, for example, you created a managed charging program that is specifically designed to minimize your distribution impacts, that program would be different than if you're looking to minimize your on-peak electricity costs. Vehicle to grid is still kind of a very future concept that we have noted a few utilities that are pursuing at this moment, but we still have a lot of work to do with auto manufacturers, and there's still quite a few stage gates left to get through in order to enable that sort of future, but we are definitely looking at what all the options are for that at this point. So first I wanted to talk real quick about some of our findings from the EV rates report I mentioned earlier. So we were specifically looking at residential EV rates, and we found a total of 64 that are currently available as of the end of September. The vast majority of those, 58, were time of use rates. One was a subscription rate with an on-peak adder, and then 5 were off-peak credit programs. Essentially using load disaggregation to identify what percentage of the EV charging was used on peak and what was used off peak, and then they were given a retroactive bill credit for all of their off-peak usage. We also identified the differences between the metering applicability. So 35 of the rates were metered through the whole house meter, and then 21 were metered separately through a submeter or a secondary meter. 8 rates were allowing customers to choose between one option or the other. As you can see, there's also from this map quite a bit of differentiation available to customers by state. So EV rates in terms of their applicability across the U.S. is still pretty widely varied. So we did a big survey in conjunction with the Brattle Group earlier this year of the utilities that had actually instituted EV time varying rates. And from that population, we asked quite a bit of questions about motivations. So in this instance, why utilities created the EV rate, first and foremost in our survey, was to incentivize adoption. So if they created an EV rate, their goal was to get that out there so folks would consider buying an electric vehicle. A lot of utilities are also in the stage where they want to research these rates. And then some others were thinking that it would help shift the load profile to minimize grid impacts and transmission service costs. Some others responded to the fact that their customers were requesting it. We did the analysis to identify what were the factors that increased enrollment most directly for these EV rates. The number one attribute was marketing budget. So we saw a 3x increase in enrollment among those utilities that had an available marketing budget over those that did not. That was probably one. It's very intuitive, but this data shows that it's extremely significant. We also found a 2.4x increase in those that had a utility-driven EV rate initiative over those that were that developed rates as a result of their customers asking for it or from regulatory bodies or legislators requesting it. Also, bill savings were extremely important, not too surprising. Free enrollment as well was a big motivator. And then the number of marketing channels that utilities utilized was another big factor. So we found one of the bigger challenges from all of this in our research, and actually something that we had not originally planned to include in our report, which was metering. And we found that metering was such a critical component of designing and developing rates in terms of both customer adoption and satisfaction, but also from the administrative perspective for the utilities. So we created this chart that shows some of the pros and cons of each of the different options, both using existing meters, secondary meters, sub-meters, telemetry through the chargers, or load disaggregation. I won't read the results for you, but I'd encourage you to take a look in the report. So next I wanted to talk about active load management, which is something that a lot of people think about first and foremost when they think about managed charging is direct load control. So it's the concept is actually fairly simplistic. Here's two examples of how you might see a direct load control program implemented. So the example on the left would be for a residential scenario where you would have a utility data center that would be sending signals via broadband to customers that are enrolled in a program. That broadband signal would then be routed from the Wi-Fi signal to the charger itself. In this instance, showing they're using OCPP as the communication channel for that. And then that would influence the rate of charge directly in the vehicle. This scenario on the right is a workplace charging option where they would then, the utility would communicate with a network service provider and send a signal to requesting some sort of change in that, that load. And so then the NSP would be sending the signal via cellular directly to those chargers, again, modulating that level of charge. So as what I just explained, there's two main aspects to consider for developing and designing a program. The first is the transport layer. This would be how the signal actually physically gets to the electric vehicle. This figure continues to stand the test of time of the different communication interfaces. So what we've seen from all of our research is that primarily a lot of them, especially for residential, are done through wireless routers. Some utilities are interested in experimenting with the possibility of using the AMI specifically to send signals through power line communication. For things like public charging and workplace charging, we're seeing a lot of usage of cellular to help send those signals, and less so with radio and wired routers. So those are definitely options, but for at least the Cat5 or Ethernet cable, it tends to be more expensive. So then the second part of developing and designing a program is what messaging protocol you might be using to send what the message is. So from this example that came from the California Vehicle Grid Integration Working Group back in 2017, there's different protocols that are currently available and that are installed in a variety of different chargers today, and vehicles, I should say. So the first example would be the domain of communication. So from the power flow entity, which could include an aggregator or a utility, to the charger itself. There are a variety of different standards: OpenADR, IEEE, OCPP, and the newest one is 63110, although I haven't seen that implemented at this point. So those first three are the primary options. And then there's a different message that would go between the charger to the electric vehicle. And again, IEEE 2030.5 or ISO IEC 15118 are those two combinations. There's also a possibility that you could send signals through telematics using proprietary protocols or 2030.5. We've seen quite a few managed charging projects to date, with the majority of the 38 that we identified at the time of the report being load control through the charging device. There's not as many load control through the vehicle or behavioral load control at this point, but we do see that changing and evolving. We also have, of the 38 projects that we identified throughout the U.S., the majority are targeting residential applications with kind of tied for second, workplace charging and public charging. What I found most interesting from the survey was that very few utilities are targeting fleets, so that would seem to be a logical first option, given that you have a large number of vehicles, potentially that you can aggregate at a single site. So how are utilities using managed charging? Mostly they're using it to avoid higher cost periods of energy supply, but the second two highest options were that they just want to help their customers. They want to help their customers manage the use and decrease costs, and also they want to use it as a way to increase customer engagement. So we did a separate survey of the industry to see of the electric vehicle chargers that are currently out in the field today that people can purchase, how many of them are managed charging capable? And then the second question was, of the network service providers that are aggregating and providing the software solutions for these chargers, how many of them have managed charging capabilities? We were very pleasantly surprised that we did this survey about 2 years ago. We were very pleasantly surprised to see quite a bit of increase in both categories. For the network service providers, we found almost 80% are capable of managed charging, and then within the charger manufacturers themselves, 65% offer at least one managed charging capable charger. If you want to see the complete list of all of the vendors for both these categories, you can download that in a spreadsheet format from the SEPA website if you're a SEPA member. We also did a survey of the equipment that's out there, what charging level was capable of managed charging. Not too surprising that most of the managed charging capable chargers were level 2, considering that seems to be a common use case. But we did see quite a few light duty DC fast charging, and then some in level 1 and medium and heavy duty fast charging. So finally, we also did a survey to see what messaging protocols were used by network service providers and charging manufacturers. As you can see from table 10, for network service providers, the vast majority were using OCPP and OpenADR 2.0, with more and more. Actually, the folks in the industry were surprised that so many of them offered 15.11.8 compatibility. That is starting to become more and more popular by network service providers. And then in table 11, the number of managed charging capable EVSE manufacturers, far and away, OCPP was the most common. So this is a very old table, and I'm reluctant to use it except for the fact that it has not yet been updated anywhere that I've seen. But basically, this was from the automakers and their 10-year time horizon, so it's actually 8 years from now at this point, which particular managed charging solutions, in this case, in 11.8, was predominantly used with some proprietary and some other options. But 15.11.8 seems to be the protocol of choice among manufacturers. So as I mentioned before, there's other techniques beyond controlling the charge at the vehicle and at the charger level. Here's just a few examples. So some of you may know SEPA works a lot in distributed energy resource management systems. DERMS would be one of those options that could then aggregate in front of the meter from a software perspective, and then collecting, all these disparate different protocols together in a way that works. AMI I already mentioned, and then possibly using load disaggregation to help provide some additional levels of analytics. Meter collars, such as those offered by companies like Connect DER. In addition to telematics, you could also use a post-production solution like an OBD2 port computer. There's also something called adaptive load management, which would be more of demand response behind the meter. So it's similar to building load management systems, but specific for electric vehicles. I mentioned circuit breakers and panels that are becoming increasingly quote-unquote smart, meaning that you can control or speak to the power those particular panels or breakers, thereby sending signals remotely that way. And then, of course, behavioral load control is an option. So there's a lot of, I won't read the list, but there's a lot of challenges to get us to a managed charging future. And I think the biggest three are, first, defining what the value is of managed charging. There's a lot of projections that managed charging is going to be very valuable, and I personally believe that it will be. But we've yet to define a set of ways to quantify that through some sort of valuation framework. The next big one is developing industry-wide standards for managed charging. So you kind of saw the alphabet soup in my presentation of different messaging protocols that exist today. I think we need some more harmonization of those standards, and utilities really present one of those big groups that can help align those industry segments. So in this illustration to the right, you speak to your customers, you speak to the vendors, and you speak to the standards community. So you have a very pivotal role in helping to get that definition of the standard or set of standards that are required by which you can actually implement demand response programs. And then I think the third biggest thing is developing least cost and reliable communication solutions. So in a lot of the early projects we've seen to date, the Wi-Fi signals tend to be a little bit less reliable, especially when you're talking about chargers that might be behind a cement wall, for example, in a garage or outside. It just becomes a little bit less reliable, and in order for us to actually be able to implement really good managed charging programs, we need to be thinking ahead about how do we increase the robustness of these signals and maybe utilize different options that would be more reliable and less cost. So I wanted to put a quick plug. I know you guys all work with Forth and in their working group, but we also have an EV working group that focuses on managed charging specifically as one of our subcommittee topics, along with rates, tariffs, and incentives and distribution planning. You can participate for free as a SEPA member. We have monthly calls the third Thursday of the month, and we invite guest speakers to participate. Let me know if you have any questions about that. Here's my contact information. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erika. And now I'm going to pass it off to Eric at Xcel.
Connor, you want to click to the summary slide?
Okay.
So thank you for having me here. Excited to talk to this group and plow through some of this content so that hopefully we can have a lively discussion here at the end of the call. But during the presentation, I wanted to give a little bit of background on who Xcel Energy is, give you some context about our broader set of EV programs, and then spend the majority of our time digging into our charging perks pilot, which is still very much in development stage, but it's I think an interesting time to talk a little bit about it because a lot of the issues we're working through are probably similar to what you all have worked through or will work through if you choose to pursue a pilot like this. Slide. A little bit about Xcel. We are a multi-state utility. I think we're in 8 states at this point. Our two biggest states are and service territories are in Minnesota and Colorado. We serve just over 4 million customers. We're vertically integrated, and we are both an electric and gas utility. Next slide. Smart charging, which is what we'll focus on, or what I'll focus on here today, is one of a number of focus areas around EVs at Xcel. And I wanted to provide a little bit of context about how that fits into the broader, our broader view of electric vehicles within Xcel Energy. So starting from the left and working right, we have a relatively small team here at Xcel. It is growing as our service territories, our regulators and stakeholders, customers show much more interest in electric vehicles and the role of the utility. Our focus has predominantly been in these three market segments, so home charging, fleet charging, and fast charging, and offering three services, these three gray boxes you see across those segments. The one service is and these are nascent. When I say service, I don't mean to that these are kind of robust and scaled, but these are in some cases in development, in other cases we put them in front of the customer, and we're kind of working through the ongoing improvement of them. But we've got an advisory focus where, in particular, for our residential and our fleet customers, we're helping those customers think about electric vehicles and how electric vehicles, they could adopt electric vehicles, the choices they have, the economic ramifications associated with adopting the vehicle. On infrastructure, we are actively looking at infrastructure investment opportunities, and in Minnesota, we have one approved fleet and fast charging infrastructure program that we haven't launched. It's still in development, but it's been approved for $25 million of primarily make-ready's investment in infrastructure. And we also have a small home charging infrastructure pilot where we're owning and operating EVSE in the customer's home, customers leasing it from us, and we're using the billing data to bill the customer against the time of use rate. Then the last box here is where I focus and what we'll spend most of our time talking about here today, which is what we're calling optimization. But basically, as Erika pointed out in her presentation, this is the combination of passive and active demand management strategies to help turn electric vehicle charging into, at minimum, a source of demand that doesn't dramatically increase utility costs, and at best kind of shape the demand to become a valuable grid resource. And we've got a couple of different pilots and programs in place within optimization, including residential rates, commercial rates, and pilot that I'll talk about here today. Next slide. So the pilot we are developing in Colorado is called Charging Perks, and it's a residential focused pilot where we are proposing, and we have approval from the commission to test active managed charging. And our objectives in doing this are really threefold. Number one, to test the technology, and I'll talk a little bit more about when I say the technology, what I actually mean there. But the point here is really just trying to evaluate, is this a viable solution from a demand management perspective? Does it work? The second objective is to understand customer interest and participation. And so we do have a rate out there for customers, which is in Minnesota, but we have a sense for customer interest in that kind of a solution. And so this is an opportunity for us to test out a little bit of a different offering to customers and gauge how they respond. And then also, when the customer is in the program, how do they participate? So are they participating, or are they overriding the demand management kind of instructions that we're sending them? And then lastly, we still don't have a full, within Xcel, we still are kind of developing a full data set around EV charging profiles. And so this is an opportunity through this pilot both to capture historical data to understand what baseline EV charging looks like without any kind of rate or smart charging overlay, and then also to look forward and see how we're able to shape that profile through active managed charging. Next slide. The pilot design, for this particular pilot, we've chosen to engage with automakers and perform demand management through vehicle telematics. So we're trying to engage with multiple automakers and we're in the contracting phase right now. So in 2 or 3 months, this list might look a little bit different, but right now we're engaged with BMW, Ford, GM, and Honda. So any customer driving a connected vehicle from one of those automakers who lives in Colorado in our service territory could participate in this pilot. To the best of my knowledge, and Erika could shed some light on this, I think there have been previous utility pilots working with automakers, but in speaking with the automakers, this would be the first kind of multi-OEM pilot where we are actually the utility is trying to integrate with one integration point as opposed to integrate with each OEM. And I'll talk a little bit more in subsequent slides about what that means and what some of the benefits are of trying to do that. Other attributes of the design here are it's infrastructureless. So because we're sending demand management instructions through telematics, we don't need the customer to make any investments in, say, a network charging station or a smart switch. And if you're a level 1 or level 2 customer, you could participate. So it doesn't really matter what charging infrastructure you have at home. We're targeting both time of use and non-time of use customers. Most of our customer base in Colorado are on a flat volumetric rate, our default rate, but we do have about 600 customers on a time of use rate, and we want to attract both of those segments into the pilot. One of the things that we are very interested in is how active managed charging overlays on top of different rate structures. So I think the value of active managed charging paired with a flat volumetric rate is pretty clear. But when you pair it with, say, a time of use rate, how much additional value is associated with some kind of active managed charging? So we're trying to at least begin to explore that question. In exchange for enrolling in the pilot, the customer would get $100 up front and somewhere between $50 to $100 per year, depending on if they were charging with level 1 or level 2 technology. We're looking to enroll up to 600 customers in the pilot. Slide. One of the unique aspects here is, of course, that we're working with the automakers, and I think that affords a few different attributes. So the first, and this is really important for Xcel, we only know a small percentage of our customers who actually are driving EVs, and those customers have self-identified themselves, but generally it's a fairly small percentage. And so by working with the automakers who know their customer base, have contact information, it presents an opportunity to really be highly targeted in our marketing. The second point here, just going from left top to right, is the automakers have access, of course, to state of charge data. And so when we're talking about demand management, that's an important attribute in making decisions about how we manage the vehicle and how do we ensure that the customer gets the charge they need. Automakers have the state of charge data to kind of enable a higher level of optimization. The scalability of this pilot is also potentially unique. We're integrating with one, rather than integrating with each individual OEM, we're integrating with one kind of aggregator point. And then lastly, there's no customer cost here. I already mentioned this kind of infrastructure less, which is a bit unique. Next slide. I did want to highlight, when I talk about these integration points, what exactly am I talking about? There's 4 different aspects that, from a program design perspective, are unique to working with automakers. And I should mention that this collaboration is part of a larger EPRI project that's been going on for quite some time called Open Vehicle Grid Integration Platform, or OVGIP. And EPRI's kind of made all this possible by allowing a collaboration to really happen between utilities and automakers. But the point of OVGIP has been to try and drive toward more simplicity from the utility perspective by enabling the automakers to collaborate. And in practice, what that we hope that means is around demand management, around customer enrollment, contracting, and the conveyance of charging data, that rather than Xcel or any other utility signing individual contracts, performing IT integrations with each OEM, each automaker, there's one integration point for at least several automakers. And in this case, we're talking about 4, but OVGIP has engaged with more than 4 automakers. So, if we can demonstrate this integration is possible and works, I think there's a lot of value from a utility perspective, and hopefully also from an automaker perspective. Next slide. I wanted to close out with a little bit more on demand management and the approach that we're taking to make all this possible. I think fits into Erika's framework that she laid out. So we are using, for our demand management system, we're using an EPRI portal. So we would log into this portal, enter information. The portal then sends through OpenADR a message to OVGIP, which is this kind of aggregator cloud. That cloud, through APIs, is connected to each automaker. So each automaker receives that message and then conveys it down to their vehicles, which are connected generally through Wi-Fi. And the open protocol, at least I believe it is primarily limited to that engagement point between the utility and OVGIP at this point. Our approach right now is, and this could change as we further develop the pilot, but our approach is to send through OpenADR a proxy production cost, an hourly production cost. So this it's not going to be actual production costs, but it will represent how those costs are fluctuating. And the point of doing that, Connor, if you click to the next slide, is to test a few different applications using one data stream conveyed from Xcel. So we are, instead of testing event-based demand response, we're testing a daily load shift here. So our expectation is that every day the customer is seeing a schedule that would be different than what they would normally charge. So if they normally charge when they come home and they plug in, generally they would be seeing a different schedule. And that schedule would be driven by the proxy production cost information that we send. And the hope is that drives 3 different grid applications or values. So one is capacity. Our vehicles shifting their charging, or our customers shifting their charging outside of our system peak. A second is energy cost savings. So our vehicles, our customers shifting their charging into the cheapest hours on our system, tend to be the early morning hours for us in Colorado. And then the third is renewable integration. So we've got a fair amount of wind on our system. During those days when there's low load and high wind production, we curtail wind power. And can we initiate charging during those times when we're curtailing wind to kind of absorb that curtailed wind? So that's the stack of applications that we're testing. And our approach, as I mentioned, is we're sending this hourly cost data to represent what's going on the grid. And then the OEM, it's really up to each automaker to take in that data to understand the customer requirements. So when you need your vehicle, what state of charge requirement do you need to meet your driving requirements? And then the current state of charge. And to take those 4 data points at minimum and perform some basic analysis to push a schedule down to the customer that would that would drive when that customer charges. And the customer will be able to opt out of that charging schedule at any point in time, likely through the app from their automaker. Next slide. And just to wrap up here, so we're targeting an end of Q1 or beginning of Q2 launch here. There is still a lot of this is maybe more complex than I ever imagined it would be doing something like this, but very interesting. And we've got a good amount of development work ahead of us to get to this Q1 launch date. So these are just the boxes, or kind of some of the things that we're currently working through with our automaker partners. So hopefully, in 6 months' time, I can have a report back about kind of what we're learning and what this pilot actually looks like in market. But hopefully the development phase has been interesting to hear about, and look forward to your thoughts and questions. Connor, that's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. So yeah, that leaves us with a few minutes for some questions. So please continue to use the attendee chat feature if you have any additional questions. And a couple have came in so far, and I will give those out. So Erika, you touched on this a little bit, but do you know any specific utilities that are using vehicle telematics to meter EV charging? And then a follow-up, do you know if any are pairing that with time of use rates?
So the question of using vehicle telematics to meter EV power use and time, I'm not aware of any utility that's using the onboard telematics at this time. The telemetry that we identified as part of our work in the latest reports was directly through the charger itself. And that, has its pros and cons as well. But that is the closest it's been at using that kind of third-party device for metering purposes. I'm not sure to this other question. Managed direct load control, absolutely. Some utilities are partnering with auto manufacturers for that purpose. And so one example that we highlighted in the managed charging report, for example, was the BMW project with PG&E. So I encourage you to take a look at that case study.
Great, thank you. And I also wanted to chime in to respond to one question. We will be sharing the contact information of the presenters to follow up in our email, and then also this lovely slide here. So please follow up with them if you have any specific questions after the presentation. A couple more questions. Question for Eric. What are the OEM perspectives on participating in the Xcel program?
I think they seem excited. I mean, they've signed up for a lot of work. So I think they definitely, the OEMs we're working with seem to believe that this is an important thing to evaluate and learn about and test. Yes, everything I've seen from these four, and I can't really speak to the OEMs outside of this group of four, shows a lot of kind of eagerness and enthusiasm for moving this forward on the telematics side.
Great, thanks. And to kind of continue on that, what kind of strategies are you using to monitor customer satisfaction during the pilot project?
Yeah, that I would say that is in development, and I'd love if anyone has great insights there, please shoot me those insights. But our thinking right now is there's a few different touch points there's always going to be the automaker touch point, and the customer will be interfacing with the automaker's mobile app primarily. So I think there's a feedback opportunity there. But to complement that, what we've been talking about is that there's a set of communications from Xcel that's kind of quarterly in nature, where it's, here's what's going on with the pilot, this is what we're learning, to the extent that we can provide a bit more personalized kind of impact analysis. We want to be able to do that. And that would represent an opportunity for the customer to kind of learn about the program and then potentially communicate with the pilot manager if they had questions or issues. And then we would be doing a middle of the pilot and an end of the pilot satisfaction survey, just to get a sense for how customers received our charging approach, and if they had issues or concerns with what we learned in the pilot.
Great. And then one more follow-up with that. Is there revenue involved for the OEMs, or is it more about customer satisfaction, or what are the other priorities with being involved in the pilot?
I can't really speak to their kind of interest more broadly speaking, but I can say there is a budget that goes directly to the automaker in the pilot that's associated with the capabilities they're providing around smart charging. So the ability to take our proxy pricing data and act on it, and then also the conveyance of charging data, pending the customer's approval. So there's dollars associated with that, and in program form there would normally be dollars associated with those capabilities. And then of course, I think they see value in the customers engaging in these types of programs, receiving incentives, having more flexible charging options, that kind of thing.
Great, thank you. And one question I had that I was surprised from your slides, Erika. Why do you think fleet projects have not been greatly pursued yet? Could you maybe go into some of the hurdles that you've identified or barriers involved in that? And do you think there will be a trend towards that in the near future?
Well, I mean, part of it is that the fleet electrification efforts are still relatively young and location specific. So maybe it was just a result of who responded to the survey that maybe that wasn't more universally considered as a near-term strategy. But I do suspect that some of it too is just a need for greater communication between that customer type and utilities to identify what are the opportunities for managed charging within that fleet. As folks probably are aware, fleets are the difference between profit and loss for a lot of companies, and so the idea for them of minimizing that charging availability may not be immediately appealing for many of them if they need access to those vehicles in those time spots. But I do think that there is some definite conversations that could and should happen. Load management strategies are certainly a huge opportunity for both utility and for fleet managers from a potential revenue perspective. So I think that like any other demand response program targeted for C&I think it's going to need to be fine-tuned for those individual customers.
Thank you. And I'm going to follow up with the final question to Erika. Does SEPA have any information on other aggregation approaches for programs not utilizing vehicle OEM controls?
Absolutely. So I would encourage Corrine to take a look at the comprehensive guide to EV managed charging. which talks about the aggregation approaches in much more depth. So, for example, she mentioned the vehicle OEM controls. I think direct load control through the charger, there's a whole lot of configurations that could be used for those purposes, both for level 1, level 2, DC fast charging. And then similarly, the slide that I had mentioned, all those other aggregation opportunities through alternative technology types, for example, DERMS or AMI, adaptive load management. Those sorts of things are, again, different aggregation strategies that could be better utilized.
Great, thank you. So that'll wrap up our presentation today. Thank you everybody for attending, and thank you to our presenters for giving a great presentation. We will be sending out the slides and a recorded version of this webinar, and will also be available on our YouTube channel to follow up. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation.